I'd like to have a chance to talk to Caroline Humphrey, who I've known for many, many years. Carrie, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in London in 1943.
Tell me the date.
The 1st of September 1943. Yes.
1st of September. Anthropologists are interested in ancestors, and some of them go back a long way, but go back to, say, your grandparents at least, and tell me something about your family and how they might have influenced you.
Well, on my father's side, my grandfather was a tea planter in India.
Really?
And yes, in the Nilgiri Hills.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was his name?
he was called Waddington.
Waddington.
And so my father, who was a scientist, was born in India and always remembered India with great love, and he remembered his ayah and the sort of warm evenings and things like this.
Did you meet your grandfather?
I never met that grandfather, no, because he was there in India and then he died. But I saw letters he'd sent to my father when my father was at school. And yeah, so that side of the family I didn't really know very much, but it influenced me, I suppose, indirectly with the thought of India as this wonderful land of sort of warmth and so on. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather was quite a high official in New Zealand. He was called Pemba Reeves.
Oh, famous. He wrote a book about
Yes. He was a
New Zealand, I think.
That's right. He was a reformer, and so he brought in, I think, things like the vote for women and things like that before that happened in Britain and so forth. Quite a sort of, in a way, a sort of left-wing person of that period. And so my grandmother, who was his daughter, was a Fabian and quite an intellectual. She was called Amber Reeves, and she went up to Newnham and read moral sciences. And she was a big influence on my life. She was the one who actually had an affair with H.G. Wells when she was a student, which became quite famous, and I think written about it and so forth. It was a big scandal at the time. And she got pregnant, and so my aunt is her daughter with H.G. Wells. And what then happened was that to the rescue, because H.G. Wells wasn't going to marry her, came a nice young lawyer who was my grandfather, who married her and made her respectable, and he, of course, was the father of my mother, he was a lawyer.
His name was?
He was called Blanco White.
Is that a hyphenated name, or Blanco is his first name, or how?
That's a hyphenated name, and in the family, there used to be this legend, I gather it's now a legend, that Blanco was a Spanish Jewish family who fled from Spain and ended up in Britain, and then took white as a sort of extra to kind of explain the Blanco, and that this was part of our ancestry. But I later discovered that this probably isn't true, that white, in fact, was an Irish sea captain who went to Spain and took the Blanco to explain the white. And this family was very Catholic. And sometime in the late 19th century, a rather famous Blanco White took exception to all this religiosity and ran away from Spain and turned up in England, where he became quite, I think, famous and friendly with leading politicians at the time, and was a rather sort of anti-religious figure, also a poet and a pamphleteer and so on. And that, I think, is the ancestor of my grandfather.
I see. And did you know that grandfather and grandmother well? Or?
Yes, I knew them very well.
And what were they like?
Well, my grandmother was a very intellectual figure, and quite scary. And she used to say things like that the only respectable academic discipline was mathematics, and you can forget everything else. And things like music were positively disgraceful, sort of sloppy emotional stuff. And she used to teach in Morley College in London, Adult Education College. She used to teach philosophy. So she was very logical.
Yeah.
My grandfather, who was a lawyer, was a much more cheery, sort of rosy figure, and he was a family lawyer, and so he used to enjoy talking about cases and things like that, I remember, from my childhood.
Okay, well, let's come down to your parents' generation, your mother and father. Tell me something about them.
Well, my mother was one of 3 children of Amber, and she was very artistic, and she became an architect, and also had something of that sort of rigour and sort of mathematical, you know, you've got to get it right sort of thing about her. And she was an architect very much in the sort of Bauhaus, modern, stylish sort of early phase of that kind of architecture in Britain, and she did build a couple of houses in Cambridge and other places, but after the war really very little was being built of that kind, and she became an architect, in fact, for the Edinburgh City Council, and so she worked all through her life, and so I had this example of a working woman as my mother.
What was her personality? You make her sound rather strict and Calvinist, but...
Oh, no, she wasn't. She was a very loving mother. But she, just in terms of what she admired, she liked things to be elegant and have style, and the same with thoughts and ideas. They should be not too woolly, nothing like that.
And your father?
My father, C.H. Waddington, came up to Cambridge and read, I think, geology, and was very friendly with people like Bernal and other well-known people in Cambridge in the 1930s. Needham was another friend of his, and he moved, I think, into genetics after graduating as a geologist. And I think he had a research fellowship at Sydney Sussex College. And both he and my mother were rather on the left. My mother was actually a member of the Communist Party. My father wasn't, but they were both sort of in that sort of group of sort of left intellectuals and so on.
Like J.D. Bernal.
Like J.D. Bernal and so forth,
Yeah.
So that was the sort of ambience.
Did you meet some of those
grew up.
people of that generation at all? I mean, you knew Needham, obviously. Did you know J.D. Bernal at all?
I must have met him as a child, yes. I met Bateson, Gregory Bateson, who was a great friend of my father's. I met Margaret Mead, it's influential on me.
What was she like?
Oh, well, she was terrific. I met her later when I was in my teens. I think my father always thought anthropology was a very interesting subject because he was friendly with Bateson and Mead. And so he used to be fascinated. At that time it was difficult for him to travel, you know. Air travel didn't really exist, and it was expensive and difficult. So, but whenever he could, he did travel. So he went to places in Africa and so on. He used to come back and tell us about these things. And part of all this was Margaret Mead occasionally arriving, you know, with stories of islands in the Pacific and this kind of thing. And I remember her saying to me once, well, if you want to be an anthropologist, don't worry about it too much, she said. 6 weeks is enough to learn any language.
Not very good advice.
Not very good advice, really, no.
She was a small and not very enormously beautiful lady from the films of her, but full of energy, I suppose.
She was full of energy, and she was, I would have thought, quite attractive in a way, especially in her youth, and she had a stick. She was quite sort of physically together.
And she was with Bateson at that time, was she? Regularly, Bateson?
Not by then, I don't think. No, I think that was earlier.
Yeah. And tell me something about your father's personality. I mean, he was a very, very distinguished academic, but...
He was, I think, perhaps quite a shy man in a way, but he had a great sense of fun, and he loved new things, and so he was always travelling. He went to America, and he liked things like he listened to jazz in terms of music, and he liked things like John Cage's experimental music, which consisted of virtually nothing, sort of silence practically. And I remember him telling me about one of John Cage's sort of art ideas, which was to do with water and the different taste of different waters. And so this art object consisted in tasting about 15 different waters, things like that. And he was intrigued by things like that. And he wrote a book about painting, abstract painting of the 50s and 60s, and the influence of scientific visions on that. So what was suddenly available as an insight into the structure of something through science, and how that sort of opened the eyes of painters in that period. It was that sort of idea.
So both your parents had an interest in artish sort of things.
Yes.
And that explains something about... I'd always been interested why you spent a lot of time as a trustee of on the governing body of the Fitzwilliam Museum, and had shown that you were interested in art and so on. This goes right back to...
Yes, it does. Yeah. Yeah.
Your father was mainly in Edinburgh, wasn't he? I mean, for a long
yes,
time.
I grew up in Edinburgh.
I was going to say that's where you grew up.
Yes.
Do you remember what was your first memory? Not sort of trees waving over your pram, but something concrete, some event or something that you think you remember. Most of these things we've been told, but can you?
Well, of any interest, I suppose I remember the house we moved into in Edinburgh after the war, which must have been when I was about 4, I suppose, which was in effect a kind of commune. It was a large 18th century sort of mansion outside Edinburgh, which my father's institute rented for the entire institute. So, because the institute was being set up anew after the war, and people didn't have enough money to buy houses and so forth, so everybody was in there, from the lab technician to the professor and so on. And it was wonderful for us children, because there was a sort of children's separate dining room, and we had lots of people to play with, and this place had a huge estate, a sort of great garden around it with statues and fountains and things, and so we had an absolutely wonderful time in there.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I have a sister.
Sister, younger or?
I have a younger sister, and I have a half brother from my father's first marriage. And yes, what could one say more? This place, Morton Hall, I think maybe that's one of the things lies behind me being an anthropologist. It was more fun for the children than it was for the adults, evidently. I mean, I think the notion of people living in a commune was very difficult after the war, and people kept feeling they couldn't, especially the women, that they couldn't express themselves as women because there was no kitchen. I mean, there was just a communal food thing, and they couldn't sort of be wives in the way that I think they thought they ought to want to be. And then I didn't know about it at the time, but I gather there were all sorts of rumours, of course, of little affairs and so on around the place. And so that sort of fell apart, I think, after about 4 or 5 years. And then we moved into Edinburgh.
Into?
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh, the main part of Edinburgh.
Yes.
And you went to your first school.
Yeah.
What do you remember your first school?
Yes, my first school was a PNEU school, which was sort of vaguely progressive school.
Parents' National Educational Union. Yes.
Is that what it was? Right, yes.
My sisters went to them too.
Yes, and that was a very pleasant place. And again, I remember a lot of emphasis placed on art and paintings and things like that.
This is a kind of kindergarten or...
Yes, it was a sort of primary school.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't very hot on learning to read and write, and so I didn't really learn to read and write till I went to my next school, which was a standard sort of Edinburgh high school.
And what age was that?
At about 7 or 8.
Mm.
And I remember coming into the bottom class of that, really not knowing how to read and write.
Mm. Did you by then have any particular interests or hobbies? I mean, did you wander around the countryside picking up frogs or interviewing the natives as a future anthropologist or anything? I mean, or collect anything? Do you remember any passions?
Well,
perhaps from a little later.
I've always, I suppose, liked gardens and sort of. I think one thing we did in our family, we did quite a lot of painting and sketching, and so I guess I was taught from a very early age to look at landscapes or trees or places and think how you might paint them, or what about that particular colour of green or the way that shadow falls and that kind of thing. So I think that was a thing I did from a very early age. And the other thing was music, really, because when we moved into Edinburgh, we were living in the same street as a refugee composer from Vienna who was called Hans Gall, and his daughter.
How do you spell his name?
G-A-L. Hans Gall. Yeah, his daughter became a very close friend of me and my sister, and almost immediately we all had lessons in playing instruments and started sort of playing in little trios and quartets and that kind of thing, and that was a very strong element all through my childhood.
What instrument do you play? Did you play?
Well, I played the piano, and I still do, and I was annoyed because my sister played the piano and the cello, and the great thing about that was, of course, you could play in many more things, and you could play in an orchestra. And my mother forbade me to learn. I wanted to learn the violin, and she wouldn't let me, because I was not actually very good at school. I was a hopeless student, in fact, and was always tailing along the bottom of the class. And I think she thought I couldn't handle 2 instruments and schoolwork.
Let's pursue music a bit, because that's always an interesting thread through life. And so, tell me about your interest in music from then up till now. Has it been important for you, and what kind of music?
Well, very important. Classical music, really. I mean, it's not that I don't like other kinds of music, but classical music, what I play and what I was somehow sort of, to some extent, trained to do. So I suppose I played quite a lot, and I came to have a very good teacher from the age of about 12. But then when I went to university, I practically gave it up, because there wasn't a teacher here, and I was just doing other things. And then when I was away in Russia and doing fieldwork and so on, it all became impossible. So although I had a piano at home, I didn't do very much. But I guess when I was in perhaps my 40s, I got one of these 2-year readership things where you have a bit more time, and I took piano lessons again. And then more recently, in the last, I suppose, 5 years, I've been having piano lessons again. And it's the most wonderful thing, because it's completely unlike, you use a completely different bit of your brain from academic work. And it's a question of kind of honing your listening and making that coordinate with the physical movements, which are absolutely tiny little things and very fast, and so you have to be tremendously in control and sort of aware and alert. And so since it's so engaging of the mind, it's a real break. If you've got some book you're writing and you're obsessed about chapter 3 or something, it's the one way you can forget all that, and it just goes out if you have to focus on playing music.
And what music? I mean, it sounds as if it's classical. In other words, Baroque and after.
Yes, I play Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, all
the greats.
The greats, yes. Yeah.
You said that it's a great sort of rest and release from academic thinking. Do you think it also feeds in any way? Because there is a theory that some writers anyway listen to music or play music, and then when they're trying to solve academic problems or in the themes of their writing and the way they write, it sort of creeps in some way, so it influences their writing. Have you ever felt?
I suppose possibly indirectly, in the sense that a piece of music has a kind of structure, and a phrase of music has a sort of shape, and perhaps one would try to emulate that in one's writing to make sure a sentence isn't too kind of lumpy and awkward, or something flows. But more directly, I think it was because I loved music. One of the main reasons that I went to Russia as an anthropologist. So when I was still at school, I had a great pash on the Russian cellist Rostropovich, and then this was at the time when these people had only just very first time come to the West, and the Russian pianist Richter, who became a sort of abiding hero because he's such a great pianist. And so one of the reasons I was so happy to choose Russia as the place I was going to work with, because all these wonderful musicians were there, you know.
Well, let's now go back to schooling. Is there anything particular to say about the school you went to when you were about 8, or do you remember any teachers, for instance, or any subjects you really hated or loved that school?
I think it was a fairly ordinary. It was a girls' school, quite strict, and I remember loving English, history, art. I mean, sort of subjects perhaps you expect somebody like me to really like. I don't think it was a very distinguished school, really, and I think probably a lot more of my education came from being in the kind of family I was in and meeting people my parents knew, and the fact that there were books everywhere in the house, and that one could be reading something that they never would have thought of at school, but I would pick it up from the shelves at home.
You were a keen reader?
Yes. Yep.
Do you remember what you were reading? What sort of?
I remember reading Proust at the age of 16.
Gosh.
Ploughing my way through.
The whole lot?
But no, I didn't read the whole lot, but I read several books of it. And my parents had sent me away to France when I was quite young. At 14, I went on those exchanges. You probably did the same thing, did you? Families, a girl would come over to Edinburgh and I would go and stay in their family. And I did that 3 summers running with a sort of group of French families. And that made me love French culture and the language. And so that was a very good thing, I think, that happened.
You must be quite a good linguist, I imagine. I mean, you've learnt several languages, maybe not in 6 weeks, but...
I don't think I am, really. I mean, I just treat languages as kind of working tools, and I've never spent much... I've never done a really formal course in Russian, for example, and Mongolian wasn't a thing you could really do anything very formal with, so I don't think I speak them very correctly, but at least reasonably fluently in the case of French and Russian, and more or less in Mongolian.
Where did you go to? What was the next school you went to, or did you go on in that same school?
I went on in that same school till I was about 18, and because, as I mentioned, I wasn't terribly good at school.
Yeah. When you say you went, before you said you were trailing at the bottom, now you weren't terribly good, you were sort of middling. Were you? How many O-levels did you take, for instance?
We didn't take O-levels. I suppose I took the average, and they took these Scottish Highers. I must have had the average number of them. And I was desperate to go to university, but not to Edinburgh, because I wanted to avoid my parents. And so I said, oh, I'd like to go to Cambridge. And they said, what? You can't do that. You're not up to that standard. And I said,
they being the school?
The school headmistress. And then they said, you make our figures look bad because you fail. And that really annoyed me. So I thought, God, I'm going to show them. So I started to work for the first time in my life. And I also got my mother nicely helped me by getting an extra tuition. So I got some A-levels and got into Cambridge.
And what were your
by
A-levels?
The skin of my teeth.
The same, history, English?
History, English, art, yeah. History of art, yeah.
And at that school, you don't paint it as particularly distinguished, but were there any teachers who strongly influenced you, or you remember?
There was a history teacher who...
Do you remember her name probably?
Miss Pearson, I think she was called.
Was she good?
Yes, she was, yes. But it wasn't, I suppose, an enormous influence. I was more influenced by my piano teacher, I have to say.
What about games? Was it a hearty school? Did you play games?
It was a hearty school, and I tried my best. I was no good at it at all, but I was in the third hockey team for my house.
Sounds distinguished. What about other things like acting or debating or sort of other extracurricular activities?
Well, that kind of thing I did at Cambridge, not really at school. So when I came here, I entered Girton College, and I suppose mostly gave up on music, although I did take up the flute. Since I was away from mother's influence, I could now take up another instrument. And yes, I did a lot in the theatre in my first 2 years.
Acting?
No, I did scenery design. So I made the scenery for all kinds of plays of different kinds.
Around 15 in England anyway, people tend to be confirmed into if they're COV. What were your parents? They sound as if they might be atheists if they were communists, but what was their religious?
Well, they were indeed atheists, yes. So I had no religious education except what happened at school. And indeed, for me, churches were kind of mysterious places of possible glamorous goings-on, because I never went into them. I suppose I was aware that other people would go to Sunday school and that kind of thing, and occasionally moan about it. So perhaps I wasn't, didn't really think it was very glamorous. But I do remember in my teens thinking I ought to sneak out and actually go to churches and see what went on with them. And I did try and poke my nose around the door of some churches in Edinburgh, but it was a pretty frosty city, and the churches were all these Scottish kirk things, and so I don't think it wasn't. I didn't get the feeling that
you couldn't drop in.
It was a dropping in sort of thing. So I suppose I was really rather ignorant of all that, and it remained so to some extent. So when here in Cambridge, people go to chapel sometimes, and I have to go to chapel these days for various reasons, and everybody lustily sings these hymns they all know so well, and I just don't know them.
Do you think this sort of distancing from religion or not being involved with it at all had the usual sort of negative effect? Because later in your life you became a world expert on shamanism, and you teach on religion, and you're interested in the religions of other cultures. Do you think that was your way of poking your nose into a religion later in your life?
Yes, I think it probably was, and I also came to be interested in Christianity, and even sort of half came to, well, perhaps for a period I was quite religious, I suppose, and I got confirmed, in fact, in the Church of England. But
when was this?
1970s, perhaps, 80s, early 80s.
So you're in your 30s, 40s.
Yes. So I think, yes, I think that's a dimension of life that I have actually got some kind of feeling for, and not that I'm terribly active with it now or anything like that, but I think it's part of, yeah.
What is your feeling now? How would you classify yourself? Agnostic?
I suppose so, yes. Perhaps, yeah. I think the culture of religion, if one can put it like that, or what religious people have done in our history is so huge and enormous. I mean, it's just so much part of the background of being a European person that you absolutely can't ignore it, and to understand it, you've got to have some feeling for what it is to be religious in it, I think.
I mean, I always ask the scientists, like Martin Rees and others, their views about this quite polarised argument that's been going on in England around Richard Dawkins and others about whether science can disprove religion. Do you have views on that? Having a famous scientist as a father, and being married to a famous scientist.
I think science can disprove many of the claims of people who are religious, from the absurdity of particular dates of creation, or particular claims for things of a sort of miraculous kind or something. But I don't think science could do anything about what people feel about essential mysteries that we don't understand and may never understand, and yet we have intimations that there are things that maybe our brains are not capable of appreciating, or at any rate there seems to be some kind of order behind things that that we don't have an explanation for. And I think all of that kind of thing is part of being human, and I don't see that science is going to disprove it or prove it.
Did any of your experiences in Mongolia and elsewhere with other forms of religion, particularly shamanism, ever make you wonder whether there were things in heaven and earth which are not recognised in our philosophy? In other words, other dimensions?
Well, some of the things that shamans can do are very extraordinary in terms of creating changes in other people, or transformations, which you might call curing or something, or reviving people. And I don't have any explanation for it. And of course, the people who believe in that see it as religious in some sense. And it is very remarkable. I mean, I do think there are some very gifted people out there, gifted in ways that maybe our culture is sort of left in abeyance or not developed. And so I've always thought the idea that you have individualism in the West, and in other cultures people are somehow conform to types or sit in cultures and just sort of reproduce them, completely ridiculous, because the most individualistic cultures, in my experience, are those that have people like shamans in them, and they have these extraordinary personalities, absolutely sort of riveting and strange, and you'd only have to meet them, you or me, and you'd see this is a most strange, amazing person, and they can do things, with this personality, and it's sort of very compelling, let's say, way of talking or way of looking and addressing people.
Mm.
Yeah.
I remember you telling me that when you tape recorded some shamanic songs or stories, that afterwards all the tapes were blank. Do you remember this?
I think it was a lama, actually, Buddhist lama. Yes. Yes. No, I think that was probably just my mismanagement of the tape recorder. But I have had experiences with shamans where there was one particular shaman who tried, or whose ability was to kind of sense other personalities somebody might have within them that don't appear as their sort of everyday kind of personality. And the way she put this was not in terms of personality, but in terms of a spirit that you might have that you don't know about, or a previous life you had that you don't know about. And she said she was capable of sort of drawing this out of you. And she did this for me and several friends. Who knows if it was what there was about it, but it wasn't something that appeared sort of haphazard or meaningless somehow.
She did. Was this former existences or alternative parts of your
This
person?
was kind of former existences, was the way she put it.
Interesting. Well, we'll probably come back to that later. So you got into Girton and came to Cambridge. Do you remember your impression when you came to Cambridge? I mean, why had you chosen Cambridge anyway?
I think
your father's early friends.
My father perhaps mentioned it as a great place. Yep.
Do you remember coming up and? Oh
no, I know why I chose Cambridge. Just before I left my high school in Edinburgh, a new headmistress appeared who had been a don at Girton. And she said, my dear, you must apply to Girton. Yes, that's right. Yep.
And you came here and enjoyed it?
Yes, I loved it. Yes, it was wonderful.
You came to read?
I came to read, I wanted to read English actually, and I wanted to be a writer. I didn't think about anthropology, but English at Girton was full that year, and so they gave me a place in anthropology, which I've never regretted, but it was sort of an accident.
Arcananth.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me of a few of the strange characters who were your lecturers and teachers in Arcananth in those 3 years.
In those 3 years. Well, I remember Maya Fortis, who was, how can I put it, a rather seemingly kind of strict and, in a way, quite dry person. I came to appreciate him later, but at the time he gave these rather sort of not textbook-like exactly, but sort of very cut and dried sort of lectures about kinship and things like that. And far more exciting, I think, to us as students at the time was Edmund Leach and Tam Bayer, who was also there, and Maurice Bloch was a graduate student at the time, but who also supervised me. And all of them were doing a different kind of anthropology from Fortis, and it was one that at the time I was much more excited by.
Were you aware of the famous tensions between, because some accounts suggest that if you went to Fortis' lectures you couldn't go to Leach's lectures and vice versa?
No, I don't think anything was quite like that. I was dimly aware perhaps that there were tensions between them of a personal kind, but one was much more aware that they just took a very different line on anthropology itself. And I suppose might almost have had different definitions of what was in anthropology, or what it was exactly.
Was Jack there as well?
Jack Goody was there too, yes.
Did you have much to do with him, or?
Not really, no. I feel that Jack somehow was in that part of the department that was more associated with 40s and African studies, and I'm not quite sure why, but I somehow was more interested in Asia and the kind of cultures
and
of Asia.
Gwilym Jones was also in that part of
Yes,
the African half wing
Yep.
of the department. What was Morris like as a teacher? I've interviewed Morris, but
Morris was I can't remember him being especially interesting as a teacher, although I now see that he's interesting. I mean, I knew him better as a graduate student myself when I had actually graduated, but as an undergraduate, I think there was a woman at Girton who was a very good teacher. What was her name again? Doris Wheatley. She was sort of attached to the department, but I think not a professor. And Audrey Richards was a very good supervisor. And all of those people really had a passion for anthropology and made it seem such an exciting and wonderful subject. I never regretted doing it instead of English.
Who were your other contemporaries, so to speak, as undergraduate?
My contemporaries are a very starry bunch. There was Jonathan Parry, there was Edith Schildkraut, there was who else was there? Keith Hart. You've probably got a memory, can fill them in better than me. Stephen Hugh Jones was very close. Marilyn Strathern was a few years older.
Susan Drucker-Brown was there.
Susan Drucker-Brown was there, yes.
I mean, the picture one gets from other people is that it was a small department with few staff, few students, much more mingling. The whatever it was called, the bun shop, was often features, and you used to go off and sort of have coffee together with the lecturers and so on in those days. Is that true?
It wasn't true of me. I felt, being stuck out at Girton, that there was probably a little inner group based in King's, because both Forties and Leach were fellows of King's.
And Tambaya.
And Tambaya, was he? Yes. Where the students perhaps did do that kind of thing, because they were supervised by these people, but I personally didn't. And as I mentioned, most of my time at Cambridge I was actually in the ADC and theatres and things, and not very devotedly doing anthropology. I mean, I was interested in anthropology, but I wasn't a sort of model student at all.
Do you remember any really exciting moments theoretically? I mean, was Levi-Strauss coming along at this time, or were there any sudden new flashes where you thought, anthropology is the thing?
Yes, I think Levi-Strauss was the thing, actually, in those days, and I remember reading La Pensée Sauvage and various other books by Levi-Strauss, and it was really exciting. And that, of course, was the kind of thing that Edmund was doing, and Mary Douglas was writing her great works at that time. Tambaya was doing that kind of thing, and it did seem to be opening out a whole new world. And one was aware that anthropology was interesting outside anthropology in those days. You know, any educated person would be reading Levi-Strauss at the time, and people would be interested in anthropology, which has completely disappeared now.
Yes, I was going to. That was the subsequent question. I mean, that isn't the case now, is it really?
No.
I mean, even very good books in anthropology aren't read much outside. Why do you think that is? Is it that anthropology has conquered the world, therefore there's nothing more to... That's how I explain it, but...
Partly that, I suppose, that people think there's nothing left to discover, maybe. But I think it was more that Levi-Strauss and the structuralists in general had a theory of looking at culture that was a theory much wider than a purely anthropological one, and so it was an approach in literary studies, wasn't it, and all sorts of different areas of academia, and it was also a universal idea. I mean, it was something that told you about humankind that people hadn't known before, hadn't thought about before. And I suppose a lot of theories in anthropology now have become so relativistic and so tied to only in the 18th century in such and such a place that it's just become much less generally interesting for people.
So you did your degree and then did well in it?
I didn't do especially well. I got a 2-1, but it was good enough to be at that time to be able to do research. And so I, by the skin of my teeth, was able to go on and do a PhD.
Did you wonder who should supervise you, or had you?
Well, I had decided I wanted to work in Russia, and so as soon as I graduated, I enrolled for a course in Russian language, which was done over here in the Sidgwick site with some ex-army tutors. Very, very efficient course. They just sort of barked it into you. You're not allowed to speak a word of English for 6 weeks, and at the end of that time it was...
So Margaret Mead was right, 6 weeks is what it takes.
Well, in fact, I suppose that's true. Yes, one could get along sort of in Russian at the end of 6 weeks after that thing, because it was total immersion. And then I determined to work in Russia, but for some reason Maya was appointed as my supervisor, and he was very against it, and he said, "Oh, Russia's you can't work there. It's too much a closed society. It's fully propagandized throughout. Nobody's simply going to talk to you and say a word that's true." And in any case, the last anthropologists who tried to go there, who was James Woodburn, were thrown out and expelled, and so just forget it. And I was put down to study rural Polish peasants. But I still wanted to go to Russia, and it so happened that academic year Maya was off in America doing something or other, and in his absence, while the cat's away, I started working on some people called Yakut, now called Sakha, living in the north of Siberia, and preparing myself to go and do fieldwork there. And so I spent a year reading every single thing I could possibly find on these people, and in sort of registering for the British Council exchange scheme with Russia, and I managed to get a studentship on that thing. So by the time Fortis came back, he had a sort of fait accompli, which was that I had this studentship to go to Russia, and I'd prepared myself to go to Russia.
Had you had a temporary supervisor looking after you, or?
No, in those days everything was much more sort of free and easy. There was no pre-field training of any kind.
I was going to say, none at all.
None at all, not as I can remember.
No advice on what you should do or anything?
Can't remember a single sausage.
So you weren't told that you had to do questionnaires or genealogies or take notes or ethics or... No ethics. No. We did have a sort of training session from the Foreign Office before we went to Russia, because it was reckoned to be, because this was in the height of the Cold War, that we would come under great sort of scrutiny from the KGB, and so we went. There were about 12 of us, I suppose. We went to this place in the Foreign Office, and they told us about various ways that we would be entrapped by the KGB. And I remember we all came out laughing and saying, "Ha! What a bit of rubbish that was." It all happened.
And it all happened. It did happen, in fact. Yes.
So what were the entrapments? Ply with vodka and...
Well, I think it was very lucky that it was very sexist, and there were not very many women in this group, 2 or 3 of us, I think, and all the men, I think, not all of them, but a lot of the men had these problems, and we were sort of left much more alone. So the men had, yes, they would be made drunk or actually drugged on one occasion, and wake up finding themselves in bed with some woman or something like that. They had that kind of thing.
Blackmail and so on.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, I mean, your father was a member of the party. I mean, he wasn't just
My mother.
Your mother. I mean, and your father was vaguely sympathetic. What didn't the Foreign Office think it might be a bit difficult for you to go and work, given that?
Well, my mother no longer was. I mean, she left in 1956 at the time of Hungary. And no, I suppose it didn't come up. But it did when I was in Russia, in the sense that I suddenly realised that I sort of knew what these people were talking about. That there must have been in my youth some kind of getting used to the notion of thinking about the working class or more disadvantaged people or equality or all those things that sort of are supposed to matter and sort of do in a socialist society. So I suppose I felt it was much less strange than, I mean, it was less strange to me than it would have been to a lot of people going to Russia.
Do you think that, I mean, you mentioned music as one of the reasons that, well, it was an added bonus in going to Russia. Do you think, I mean, it was quite an odd place to choose. Do you think your family background, the fact that your parents had that left-wing leaning and so on, they must have been discussing Lenin and Marx and the rest of it when you were a child, was another influence or not?
Well, I don't remember them ever discussing Lenin or Marx, and absolutely zero thing of that kind. It was more, I suppose, a general attitude, perhaps, and a sort of an absence of what I think you might get in a lot of middle-class English households, of a sort of horror aspect about Russia. You know, this scary, frightening place. I don't think I ever got that sense from my parents. And that was a big plus, because practically everybody at that time thought it was a most, you know, the other side of the world, and so on. And I did also have a Latvian nanny at one point, briefly in my childhood, who was a refugee after the war, and she, I remember telling me lots of folk stories of a Russian sort of Latvian kind, about forests and things like this, and
so it was a fairy tale land.
Fairy tale land as well. Yes.
Yeah, that's nice. Music and fairy tales. But what was it like when you got there? I mean, people like sometimes remember that first week. Do you remember the first week?
Well, I first went before I actually intended to do anthropology when I was a student, just camping there as a sort of exploration. And we got a ferry and we had a car and we drove from Finland. And I do remember sort of disembarking at Leningrad, and it did, I have to say, by comparison with any country in the West, even like Finland, immediately gives this impression of incredible greyness and drabness and sort of grimness, because everybody was dressed very differently. The houses were all sort of rather dusty looking and concrete edifices. This was a place that had been bombed during the war, and so there was zero elegance about it, and all the food was very kind of rough and ready, and so it did definitely have the feeling of being another world. You know, you had to adjust all your sense of colour and what people's personalities might be like, or all the sort of tone of life was utterly different. Which it isn't now, actually, but it was then. It really was.
And was it when you went for your proper fieldwork? It was like that too.
Yeah. I was in Moscow University, in that great skyscraper building, and I was sharing a sort of accommodation with a a Russian girl who I later realised was there to obviously report on what I was doing. And I do remember, again, just the feeling that everything was somehow different. The smell of things, the taste of food, the clothes people wore, the books people were reading in the university, the way professors behaved. It was just sort of completely other world. Yep.
What was the fieldwork about? What was the question you were going to ask in your fieldwork?
Well, I was initially planning to go to North Siberia and work on the Yakuts, and I was very interested in the notion of these people who had arrived from the south. They were horse-breeding Turkish language speakers. So they'd come from somewhere way down in Central Asia and found their way up to this place, which was actually beyond the Arctic Circle. So these were people living as nomads with herds of horses and cattle in an inconceivably harsh environment. So I was very interested in that, in how you could make a life for yourself with such a culture in a place that's so utterly difficult and dangerous for that kind of life. But when I got to Moscow, my professor said, you can't go there. Forget it. It's impossible. I don't know what the real reasons were, but what he said was, you can't move there in spring and autumn because it's a big swamp, and in the winter it's inconceivably cold. It's the coldest place in the world, which was true. And in the summer, it's full of mosquitoes. And anyway, he just said you can't go, and so then I had to find somewhere else, and so I had to redo my whole preparation.
So where did you?
Well, we had a sort of bargaining session. My plan for work had to be inserted in the plan of the department, because everything in Russia was done according to a plan. And so at the beginning of the year, I had to sort of work out, together with them, we had to work out, and it was decided I would go to the Buryats, who are quite similar to the Yakuts in a way, but living in the south of Siberia as opposed to the north. And then I had months and months and months in Moscow waiting to get a permission to actually go and do field work.
How long?
About 10 months.
Oh, that must have been...
Or perhaps appalling. A bit less, perhaps 9 or
appalling, both financially and...
Well, no, because it was part of the research, and I mean, I had to do it because I didn't know anything about the Buryats, and so I spent 9 months reading about them, with the result that I now have really good historical knowledge, because I spent every single day in the Lenin Library from dawn to dusk reading about these people, and it was incredibly useful, and it was part of the research, and I think living in Moscow was part of the research. I mean, you learned a lot about Soviet life just by living in Moscow.
So you did about a year before you went. I mean, in Russia, you'd done a year before you left. So by the time you got to the field, it was 2 years into your...
More or less, yeah.
And then how long do you stay in the field?
I stayed 2 months in the field.
2 months?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's shorter.
Yes.
How was that?
Well, it was... To start off with, it was kind of planned. I mean, it's not like the kind of field work people do now. It had to be sort of negotiated every step of the way. And it wasn't just that I had to get permission from Moscow University to leave Moscow. I had to get permission at the other end for them to receive me. And I only did this by sheer luck, really, which was that somebody from Buryatia came to Moscow and dropped in on my professor, who became a good friend of mine, and I managed to impress this woman with what a nice and innocent person I was, and how she'd like to have me visiting, and she very kindly issued this invitation. Otherwise I never would have been able to go, because people really didn't. I mean, no foreigner stepped anywhere really, and nobody had done anything like this before, and this was a very, very long way away. It was, way the other side of Lake Baikal and so on.
Mm.
So I managed to arrange that, and then when I got there, I found they had a schedule for me that I was going to go to this collective farm for 1 month and the other one for the other.
Mm.
So I didn't have any choice about where I went,
Mm.
but it was fine.
Mm. When you say no one had been there, there was some famous earlier Russian, I can't remember the name, Zygoritsky or something, people who wrote about shamanism and so on, among the Buryats, I thought.
Oh yes, well, lots of
Shigoritsky
Russian,
or,
Shirokogorov, you mean?
yes, yeah.
Yes, lots of Russians, of course, have been there. I meant sort of no
Western.
anthropologists have been there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the Buryats are very well studied.
Mm.
One reason is that they lie on the direct route between Moscow and Beijing, more or less.
Oh.
So anybody who went on, say they were a big Russian expedition going to China, or missionaries, or armies, and in the whole great game in which Russia was kind of competing with Britain over Tibet, all the Russian explorers, and they were mostly army officers, would have to go to Buryatia, and they used the Buryats as kind of assistants and spies and so forth in all these expeditions. So it was tremendously well studied.
But not from here.
Yeah.